Now, I know when we touched on initially, like separating successful, multifamily investors versus ones that aren't successful, could we dive into perhaps common mistakes that new multifamily real estate investors make that you've seen?
Yeah, I would say one. I think kind of starting with an end goal in mind makes a huge difference. And we had touched on this a little bit before we started. But if from day one we had a really aggressive target where we were going to go, and what that did was allowed us. If I came out here and said, look, in the next 10 years, I'm going to own 100 units, right? If that was the target, we probably wouldn't have one employee have came on board. And if we did, they wouldn't be a quality. Like to attract people that are quality, which you need a team if you're going to do this at scale. I think you have to have a big enough target that everyone's dream can be in there. Like there's going to be room for someone to be a incredibly high level person in our organization. So I think that has to do with it. One thing that like a lot of companies did that we tried to stay away from was it's very easy, I think, and we could probably be much bigger unit wise if we just went and bought every small property for cheap. So there's a ton of stuff you can buy downtown for almost nothing, and there's a model there that people can do. But I think it gets increasingly hard to manage. And if you look at like a lot of our big competition did start in more rural spots, and they still hold all those properties. To me, that is just a management night. Like I don't understand how you can manage a portfolio of thousands of 20-unit buildings spread out in all these markets. So I think being pretty tactful on where you buy the properties and what they are. So kind of our thesis on that too was I would like to buy properties that maybe on their own a bigger company wouldn't buy, but in a portfolio of a couple thousand would take them. So that's why we're in that now. What we look for is kind of in that 100-unit range. I'm not buying a bunch of 20-unit properties to hold because who will ever buy that on the other end? So I think you need, if the goal is to be big, which ours is, we want to scale it up. I think you need to, you need to have that in mind when you're starting out, because the management is what can vary you, I think, so quickly. And I look at, those, and even the smaller buildings, they're just very, very hard to manage. And it's for sure when they're spread out, like you're making all these trips to little places. And so I think, starting with the end in mind I guess would be one thing that would make a big difference.
I would say, like, I think most people would say that you've set up a pretty successful multifamily business, right? What do you, in your opinion and your experience, what do you think sets successful multifamily real estate investors apart from unsuccessful ones?
I think there is kind of two sides to the business. There's the operating side of the actual asset, and there's the investment side. And I think a lot of times people get pretty narrow-sighted on one side of it. So they'll be like, oh, they just focus on the property side, and they're not looking at it as an investment or how an investor might look at it. And I do think both sides are very required. And then I think on the other side, you have a lot of people who will jump in and they're just doing it for the fees. So they're just trying to buy property and they don't really care how it's operated. And then that never works out long-term either. So I do think it makes a difference on both sides. And we have kind of that experience of every level of it. So when we ran the mobile home parks, it was just me and my wife. We were doing everything. We collected the rents. They were manually reading the waters every month. And it was when we first took it over, it was a pretty rough tenant base. And it was a big park. That was our first thing. And it was 69 pads. So it was, a lot of tenants and a lot of it was cash. And so we've learned, you learn it from the ground up, and pretty much every step through there we did, even a couple of years ago, we were doing all the renovations ourselves. And then, the guy who runs our management company now, he started same thing. He's pretty much worked his way up and done every level of the business. So I do think it's important to understand the real estate side, and on the investment side, you have to look at it how an investor would look at it, I guess, instead of how an operator always looks at it.